Darkness rippled across a wounded horizon of organic metal and seething green light. Deep within the collapsed sheath of void space, where fractured hyperspace membranes still screeched like dying creatures, the Yuuzhan Vong world ship, known as Domain Chosen, finally tore free. It burst into a galaxy that did not know it existed. A galaxy built on logic and machinery. A galaxy of cold, unfeeling steel. The world ship shuddered as reality knitted itself closed behind it. Plates of living coral groaned like something emerging from a birthing chamber. Bioluminescent nerves flared across its surface, flickering in waves of pain and relief. Organic weapon cysts pulsed in slow rhythms. Tissue sails stretched and healed from their violent transit. The crew knelt in reverence to both the agony and the survival. The Yuuzhan Vong bowed their heads on the living deck. Their armor of scarred flesh and coral spikes glistened wetly, each warrior marked by ritual mutilations and tattoos declaring their vow to the gods. They whispered praise to Yunyamka, the god of war, to Yunharla, the deceiver, and to Yuuzhan, the creator who shaped all life through suffering. A priest raised his staff of vertebrae and flesh. His voice vibrated in whispered ecstasy. We have crossed the void. We have entered another galaxy, a galaxy ripe for cleansing. The Shapers could barely contain their joy. This galaxy's coordinates did not match any mapped by scouts. This was new conquest, new worlds to reshape, new flesh to test, new enemies to suffer. The priest's face stretched with reverence. Already the gods smile upon us. Already the path is blood. The Vong rejoiced. But the living world ship did not. It trembled, not from reverence, from fear. Something vast and silent surrounded them, something hungry, something that did not feel agony or breathe or worship, something that existed without blood, without life. The void outside was not empty, it was watching. Sensors of living eyes mounted along the ship's hide began to blink in synchronized alarm. Long pulsating nerves signaled intrusions. Organic spines stiffened. The ship's living cortex echoed a warning throughout its biomass. Approaching constructs. The warriors prepared for contact, but their shock was immediate. The first shapes emerging from the darkness were not ships as they understood them. They were cubes, cold, geometric, perfect to the point of insult. Their surfaces were black, veined in green halos of fractured energy like corrupted veins under sickly skin. There were no angles of beauty, no imperfections, no scars. This was blasphemy. The nearest Yuuzhan Vong commander spat to the floor. Mechanical abominations, lifeless things. A galaxy ruled by false gods of metal. The priest growled with sacred disgust. These constructs defy the truth of pain. They must be purified. In the dark, the constructs spoke. The sound did not come from mouths. It came from everywhere at once. A droning voice, emotionless, without soul. We are the Borg. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. The Vong stared in contempt. Their commander barked out a laugh. Words without suffering, without ritual, without blood, the Shapers sneered. Assimilated? As if flesh could be made obedient to metal, as if true life could ever accept such defilement. The Borg cubes advanced. Nanoprobes were fired in torrents like microscopic locusts, carried on beams of compressed energy. Vong hulls reacted instantly. Bioplasmic tissue hardened. Living membranes screamed, then devoured the probes as nutrients, dissolving the nanites before they could attach. Instead of assimilation, the ship fed on them. The Borg never hesitated. More beams struck. More nanites deployed. Data viruses streamed forth. Assimilation tubules launched from spore-like pods in mechanical swarms. Every single tactic failed. Coral armor absorbed and digested the invasive code. Capillary systems chewed through the metallic microbes and released them as waste. Neural clusters of the ship recoiled from digital intrusion the way human flesh rejects a splinter. Nothing penetrated, nothing adapted, nothing converted. The Borg recorded something they had never observed. Immunity detected. The Yuuzhan Vong roared triumphantly as if hearing a divine anthem. Their world ship's weapons awakened. Bioorganic cannons throbbed and released torrents of plasma, not fire, but corrosive living acid that latched onto mechanical surfaces and ate through them like liquid starvation. Kukai insects swarmed, burrowing into Borg hull plating and multiplying with parasitic hunger. For the first time in their collective history, the Borg watched their metal deteriorate like rotting bone. The Vong believed this reaction to be divine favor. The commander raised his amphistaff high, its serpent-like body hissing, and shouted to his warriors, "Behold the false gods of metal! They scream under the truth of pain." The Borg did not scream. They only adapted. They attempted to infect the insects. They attempted to alter alloy to resist acid. They attempted to code through bioneural defenses. Each data attempt hit a wall. Every counter-infection failed. All adaptation resulted in decay. The collective spoke again, but this time in calculation, not command. Error. No assimilation possible. Biological rejection complete. The Yuuzhan Vong interpreted the quiet pause that followed as fear. They mistook Borg analytical silence for submission. The priest declared it loudly. They bow before the gods of pain. They acknowledge our supremacy. The Borg did not bow. They reevaluated. Unknown species immune to nanotechnology. Unknown biological systems self-repair. Organic shield response unpredictable. The collective had encountered resistance before. They had conquered species that resisted assimilation, but they had never found something that rejected the very concept of assimilation as if it were poison. This was not simply resistance. This was rejection at a foundational level, a violation of Borg logic, a species not compatible, not catalogable, not convertible. Yuuzhan Vong biotech was not life to them. It was chaos given form. A new line entered the collective's data core, a new category, unable to process. The commander saw the Borg hesitation and interpreted it as weakness. He laughed, and his warriors banged coral blades against their own bodies until they bled with exhilaration. The Shapers cried in joy. The priests whispered prophecies of destruction. We have found a galaxy ruled by faithless machines. The gods send us to punish it. The Borg prepared for counter-assault. The Vong prepared for holy war. One side saw blasphemy. The other saw anomaly. Both decided that the other must be undone. The war began in seconds. The Borg opened with their standard doctrine of immediate subsumption. Cubes began forming intricate geometric formations, linking tractor beams into a lattice meant to hold the Vong world ship in place for invasive boarding. On the surface, the living ship pulsed with agitation. Muscles and tendons bulged across organic plating, pushing against the invisible grip as though trying to tear out of a predator's jaws. The lattice intensified. The Borg increased power output. A normal vessel would have been immobilized, but the Vong ship was not a construct. It was a living organism built to fight like a beast. Organic tendrils snapped outward from the hull, bristling with hardened bone. They flexed like muscles resisting shackles. The creature did not surrender to force. It strained against it with feral instinct. Every bulge, every twitch, every spasm strained impossibly against raw mechanical power. Then, something in its biology responded to pressure, not with retreat, but with furious adaptation. The ship's outer muscles expanded, layered thickly with new cells forming in seconds. Its tendons hardened with a crackling sound as organic fibers crystallized into living armor. The more the tractor beams pressed, the stronger the world ship's tissues became, fueled by stress, commanded by instinct. The Borg attempted to counter with additional beams, but the organism only grew more monstrous under the strain. Borg logic could analyze tension. It could quantify resistance, but it could not comprehend a ship that embraced pain as growth. Internal cilia pumped adrenaline-like compounds across its living structure. A roar shook its decks as the world ship broke free from the tractor lattice. Vessels of pulsing blood vessels inflated and burst, sacrificing layers of tissue to tear loose. The ship ripped itself from the Borg grip like a predator gnawing its own limb to escape a trap, but its flesh sealed behind the severed membrane almost instantly. The wound healed as it formed, leaving behind only a fresh scar of regenerated armor. And the Vong warriors felt the ship's agony with pride. They knelt, pressed hands to the quivering deck, and honored the pain. The Borg recalculated. They shifted from immobilization to annihilation tactics. They spoke through the void again, emotionless and resolute. Biological contamination incompatible. Termination required. Weapons cycled with chilling unity. A volley of green lances cut through space, tearing open engines on living cruisers forming the Vong escort. One vessel ruptured in a burst of screaming biomass, and the warriors aboard erupted into frenzy, laughing, praising Yuuzhan for the glory of violent death. Another ship was dissected by magnetometric beams, severed like flesh beneath a scalpel, and yet the crew howled declarations of mercy in the afterlife. The Borg witnessed displays of devotion to suffering, but misread them as primal irrationality. They attempted a new analysis through collective computation. These organisms reject pain as deterrent. They seek pain. They encourage harm to self and other. They are incompatible with optimization. To the Borg, optimization was truth. Efficiency was existence. A species devoted to agony violated every aspect of logic. They could not process a culture that mutilated themselves not to survive, but to worship. The collective struggled to compute it. Their processors ran probabilities on how to undermine a species that welcomed hardship as joy. Yuuzhan Vong commanders saw the Borg pause and mistook it as further weakness. Warrior chants erupted, amphistaffs hissed, weapons flexed their living spines, and organic cannons swelled like beating hearts ready to burst. In mechanoid silence, Borg vessels responded. Adaptive refractive shields flickered as drones constructed biothermal filters, attempting to block corrosive plasma. They injected code directly into their shield matrices, rewriting physical properties in real time. Their beams sharpened, their phasers adjusted wavelength and spectrum output, searching for vulnerability. Yet Vong weapons were not predictable. A plasma cannon fired, and its substance shifted mid-flight, mutating composition like a living thing. The Borg blocked one attack only for the next to digest their shielding like a feast. The collective recalculated waveform frequencies 20,000 times in a second, But the weapon's biology shifted faster than data. It was not technology. It was evolution. Rapid, instinctive, undirected by strategy, yet equally guided by fanatic purpose. A cube's armament faltered for one single moment. The world ship seized the opening, ramming a spine-tipped protrusion directly into the Borg hull. The organic spike pierced metal plating, sank deep into machinery, and burst into tendrils hungry for fuel and circuitry. It began devouring everything it touched. Borg drones swarmed to cut it free and were dissolved alive. Their implants melted through their bodies. Their flesh dissolved faster than the machine. This was new. The Borg struggled to categorize the weapon's biology. It did not infect, assimilate. It devoured. Territory began falling, not to conquest or occupation, but consumption. The collective prioritized preservation of knowledge. They calculated the species must be studied, not destroyed. They issued a command that no Borg ship had ever before spoken in the history of the collective. This entity cannot be absorbed. It must be observed. Observation became a kind of surrender. The Borg withdrew their forward cubes for analysis, retreating just outside weapon range. They paused all assimilation attempts. They stopped trying to convert their enemy. The order echoed through the Vong ship's psychic-like organic senses. They recognized retreat. They interpreted it not as calculation, but as terror. The commander raised his voice. "Hear the false gods flee before us. They know their sins. They fear our purity." The priest lifted his face to the heavens, eyes wet with reverence. The gods have delivered prey to purify. The Vong prepared a holy assault, not for victory, but for cleansing. The Borg prepared to learn, not for mercy, but for evolution. Two species stared into each other across the void. One saw soulless abominations deserving annihilation. The other saw a paradox so incompatible it demanded transformation. The war was not born out of territory or resources. It was born because neither side could tolerate the philosophy of the other. The Borg retreated a measured distance, still united in a cold silence that made every move seem emotionless. They formed a perimeter of observation, not surrender. Cubes aligned into a ring that glowed with sickening precision, their hull plating shifting to adapt, analyze, classify. Energy signatures rippled through the void, not as weapons this time, but as instruments probing the nature of the Yuuzhan Vong. They studied chemical composition of the world ship's flesh, scanned bone density of its organic armor, examined venom sacs hidden beneath its living artillery. They watched with the fascination of predators confronted by prey they could not digest. Within their collective mind, calculations assembled into frameworks. Drones began constructing new nanomachine clusters designed not for assimilation, but decomposition. Nanoacids, anti-organic subatomic razors, molecular disruptors, tiny swarms that could burrow into biology and rearrange neural tissue, interrupting pain-based communication. They were attempting to adapt, not to convert, but to kill a form they could not consume. The Yuuzhan Vong saw none of this strategy. Their commanders only saw hesitation and interpreted it as divine panic. The warrior ships surrounded their central world ship, writhing with bioluminescent fervor. The Vong felt blessed, chosen to fight an enemy who embodied foul deception and false order. Nothing enraged them more than a life without suffering. An existence without ritual pain was an existence without virtue. To them, a being without agony was a monster. The priest of domain chosen raised his staff and pressed its barbed bone tip into his own chest. Blood dripped across the living deck, absorbed by the ship like sustenance. He proclaimed with trembling reverence, "The machines lack agony and thus lack soul. We shall bleed life back into their void." His words ignited frenzy. Warriors carved fresh scars into their exposed flesh. They mutilated themselves to attract the gaze of their gods. Pain was not sacrifice. It was currency. It was prayer. And the world ship itself trembled in pleasure at the blood it absorbed from its loyal crew. Each wound deepened its bond with them. Its hull thickened with their devotion. The entire vessel vibrated like a living war chant. The Borg misread the biological surge as random interference. They scanned it, attempting to decode the energy signals in the flowing blood, unaware it was a holy state of communion between warrior and ship. Calculations accelerated. They detected organic communication networks they could not intercept. They attempted to break them with frequency jamming, assuming it was electrical signaling. The world ship ignored the interference because it did not speak with currents. It spoke through biochemistry, through pain intensities, through hormones released in ritual. Anguish was command. Devotion was strategy. The ship obeyed through ecstasy. The collective concluded that the enemy used an unpredictable, untranslatable, supremacist biological information system. They could not hack devotion. They could not decode prayer. A new Borg subassessment formed within the hive mind. Enemy communication is irrational. Enemy logic is disorder. Enemy resistance is not strategic. To them, the lack of strategy meant the Vong were chaotic and inefficient. They could not conceive that ritualized agony was not irrational, but structure. It was doctrine. It was law. The Vong were not chaotic. They were orderly in their own sacred torment. Their strategies were predetermined by theology, not survival. They embraced inefficiency not because they failed to understand efficiency, but because they rejected it. The Borg calculated that the Vong lacked optimization. The Vong believed optimization was a blasphemy against creation. The two species misinterpreted each other so completely, so fundamentally, that misunderstanding itself became the battlefield. When the Borg launched their nano-acid swarms, they believed they had found the answer. The clouds of microscopic death spread silently, seeping toward the world ship like invisible mist. The Vong could not see them through ordinary senses, and the swarms bypassed normal defenses. They slipped past the hardened muscles of the organic hull. They bypassed the cilia-lined vents. They entered through air gill channels and into the ship's circulatory system. Tiny machine razors shredded biofibers from within. The world ship convulsed and screamed. A shudder pulsed through its spine, shaking every deck. Nerves lit with agony, and the crew fell to their knees in ecstasy, misinterpreting its death throes as union with their gods. The priest moaned in blissful awe. The warriors cried out in prayerful rapture. The Borg observed the reaction with clinical disinterest, continuing to refine the attack. They shifted nanite instructions, evolving them into corrosive entities engineered to break neural tissue of both ship and crew. The Vong collapsed one by one as the world ship's agony spread into them through its communion link. Muscles seized, hearts raced, lungs constricted. The ship's blood vessels burst. The living hull bled and leaked fluids into space. The Vong praised every second of it. They thought the gods were giving them a trial. They believed they were being strengthened. the pain became too intense to endure. Warrior after warrior died, smiling through shredded throats. The Borg drones recorded the scene and processed it as malfunction. The collective concluded the species had no concept of self-preservation. Their final report before the second wave of nanites: these organisms seek termination. They engineered the weapon to accelerate systemic collapse. Yet the moment before critical failure, when the ship was seconds from death, a Vong shaper crawled forward through blood and torn flesh. She pressed her hands onto the living deck, forced the ship's organs to shift, and commanded it with biotic rituals to adapt. She rewrote its pain. She absorbed its agony into herself, guiding neural impulses into new patterns. Her bones cracked. Her eyes bled. Her body deformed into a twisted hybrid state as she fused her nervous system with the ship's. She redirected the nano acid through sacrificial tissue, sending it into sacs that burst into the void. The world ship healed through her broken body. It revived through her mutilation. The Borg observed a new conclusion. Enemy adapts through suffering. Yuuzhan Vong warriors screamed in exultation as the ship roared with rebirth. Pain was not weakness. Pain was algorithm. Pain was adaptation. And now the collective understood the most terrifying truth they had ever recorded. Pain was their technology. The Borg retreated a measured distance, still united in a cold silence that made every move seem emotionless. They formed a perimeter of observation, not surrender. Cubes aligned into a ring that glowed with sickening precision, their hull plating shifting to adapt, analyze, classify. Energy signatures rippled through the void, not as weapons this time, but as instruments probing the nature of the Yuuzhan Vong. They studied chemical composition of the world ship's flesh, scanned bone density of its organic armor, examined venom sacs hidden beneath its living artillery. They watched with the fascination of predators confronted by prey they could not digest. Within their collective mind, calculations assembled into frameworks. Drones began constructing new nanomachine clusters designed not for assimilation, but decomposition, nanoacids, anti-organic subatomic razors, molecular disruptors, tiny swarms that could burrow into biology and rearrange neural tissue, interrupting pain-based communication. They were attempting to adapt not to convert, but to kill a form they could not consume. The Yuuzhan Vong saw none of this strategy. Their commanders only saw hesitation and interpreted it as divine panic. The warrior ship surrounded their central world ship, writhing with bioluminescent fervor. The Vong felt blessed, chosen to fight an enemy who embodied foul deception and false order. Nothing enraged them more than a life without suffering. An existence without ritual pain was an existence without virtue. To them, a being without agony was a monster. The priest of Domain Chosen raised his staff and pressed its barbed bone tip into his own chest. Blood dripped across the living deck, absorbed by the ship like sustenance. He proclaimed with trembling reverence, "The machines lack agony and thus lack soul. We shall bleed life back into their void." His words ignited frenzy. Warriors carved fresh scars into their exposed flesh. They mutilated themselves to attract the gaze of their gods. Pain was not sacrifice. It was currency. It was prayer. And the world ship itself trembled in pleasure at the blood it absorbed from its loyal crew. Each wound deepened its bond with them. Its hull thickened with their devotion. The entire vessel vibrated like a living war chant. The Borg misread the biological surge as random interference. They scanned it, attempting to decode the energy signals in the flowing blood, unaware it was a holy state of communion between warrior and ship. Calculations accelerated. They detected organic communication networks they could not intercept. They attempted to break them with frequency jamming, assuming it was electrical signaling. The world ship ignored the interference because it did not speak with currents. It spoke through biochemistry, through pain intensities, through hormones released in ritual. Anguish was command. Devotion was strategy. The ship obeyed through ecstasy. The collective concluded that the enemy used an unpredictable, untranslatable, supremacist biological information system. They could not hack devotion. They could not decode prayer. A new Borg subassessment formed within the hive mind. Enemy communication is irrational. Enemy logic is disorder. Enemy resistance is not strategic. To them, the lack of strategy meant the Vong were chaotic and inefficient. They could not conceive that ritualized agony was not irrational, but structure. It was doctrine. It was law. The Vong were not chaotic. They were orderly in their own sacred torment. Their strategies were predetermined by theology, not survival. They embraced inefficiency not because they failed to understand efficiency, but because they rejected it. The Borg calculated that the Vong lacked optimization. The Vong believed optimization was a blasphemy against creation. The two species misinterpreted each other so completely, so fundamentally, that misunderstanding itself became the battlefield. When the Borg launched their nano-acid swarms, they believed they had found the answer. The clouds of microscopic death spread silently, seeping toward the world ship like invisible mist. The Vong could not see them through ordinary senses, and the swarms bypassed normal defenses. They slipped past the hardened muscles of the organic hull. They bypassed the cilia-lined vents. They entered through air-gill channels and into the ship's circulatory system. Tiny machine razors shredded biofibers from within. The world ship convulsed and screamed. A shudder pulsed through its spine, shaking every deck. Nerves lit with agony, and the crew fell to their knees in ecstasy, misinterpreting its death throes as union with their gods. The priest moaned in blissful awe. The warriors cried out in prayerful rapture. The Borg observed the reaction with clinical disinterest, continuing to refine the attack. They shifted nanite instructions, evolving them into corrosive entities engineered to break neural tissue of both ship and crew. The Vong collapsed one by one as the world ship's agony spread into them through its communion link. Muscles seized, hearts raced, lungs constricted. The ship's blood vessels burst. The living hull bled and leaked fluids into space. The Vong praised every second of it. They thought the gods were giving them a trial. They believed they were being strengthened. The pain became too intense to endure. Warrior after warrior died, smiling through shredded throats. The Borg drones recorded the scene and processed it as malfunction. The collective concluded the species had no concept of self-preservation. Their final report before the second wave of nanites. These organisms seek termination. They engineered the weapon to accelerate systemic collapse. Yet the moment before critical failure, when the ship was seconds from death, a Vong shaper crawled forward through blood and torn flesh. She pressed her hands onto the living deck, forced the ship's organs to shift, and commanded it with biotic rituals to adapt. She rewrote its pain. She absorbed its agony into herself, guiding neural impulses into new patterns. Her bones cracked, her eyes bled. Her body deformed into a twisted hybrid state as she fused her nervous system with the ship's. She redirected the nano acid through sacrificial tissue, sending it into sacs that burst into the void. The world ship healed through her broken body. It revived through her mutilation. The Borg observed a new conclusion. Enemy adapts through suffering. Yuuzhan Vong warriors screamed in exultation as the ship roared with rebirth. Pain was not weakness. Pain was algorithm. Pain was adaptation. And now the collective understood the most terrifying truth they had ever recorded. Pain was their technology. The Yuuzhan Vong world ship bled and healed in the same breath, its flesh still rippling from the attack. Yet the crew remained in reverent silence as the priest caste gathered at the center of the living deck. The air stank of iron-rich blood, burned muscle, and humid exhalations from the ship's exposed organs. Warriors knelt with bowed heads. The shapers stood poised, fingers trembling with creative hunger. The ship's own nerves pulsed beneath their feet, waiting for command. The priest raised his face toward a tangled cluster of living lights pulsating above him, like luminous veins wrapped around bone branches. He spoke not to the crew, but to the gods who he believed were listening through the ship's pain. The false machines seek to heal us. His voice quivered with outrage. Warriors clenched their blades reflexively, disgust rising like bile. They wished to steal our agony, to cure our devotion, to make us soulless. A roar of hatred erupted around him. The idea of losing pain was not liberation to them. It was annihilation. Their culture, their laws, their purpose, all rooted in sacred suffering. To strip them of torment was to desecrate existence itself. It would leave them meaningless. It would make them abominations worse than death. The priest continued, trembling. They would make us like them, hollow, lifeless, without the will of the gods, without scars. The very word sounded like poison in his mouth. Scars were scripture. Scars were history. Scars were identity. The priest slammed his fist against his own chest, driving bone shards embedded in his knuckles into his flesh. He bled openly, letting the ship absorb it through its quivering membranes. We must create agony they cannot cure. Shapers lifted their instruments, grown tools of cartilage and teeth, pulsating with embryonic enzymes. Their hands shook with hunger. This was a challenge more sacred than any war. They would craft suffering beyond medicine. Pain no cleansing could erase. Brutality that healed stronger and sharper than before. They would transform agony from vulnerability into unstoppable evolution. The shapers whispered among themselves with frantic excitement. They began discussing ways to amplify pain-linked adaptation. They debated altering nervous tissue to become reliant on torment for function. They considered reconfiguring regenerative cells so that injury triggered explosive mutation. If suffering became the mechanism of growth, then curing pain would cripple the Vong completely. Thus, pain must be made indispensable. A shaper proposed merging living weaponry directly with warrior nervous systems, connecting ship and host into united sensory agony. Another imagined vessels whose hulls fed on the crew's pain, evolving through their trauma. A third suggested inserting organisms that fed on neural shock, powering the ship by devouring the agony of its defenders. Their minds spiraled into sacred invention. They were no longer building weapons. They were building religion in flesh. Meanwhile, in the cold recess of Borg space, The collective organized their counterplan. Drones wove streams of logic into evolving matrices. Their understanding of the Vong changed from resistance to infection. The Borg viewed pain as a disease now, faith as a pathogen, cultural devotion as a neurochemical disorder. They constructed countermeasures not against biology alone, but against belief systems. In biomechanical data vaults, drones developed neural suppression constructs, nanite chains designed to silence pain receptors. They engineered subdermal disruptors capable of eliminating trauma response. They began programming assimilation implants that would erase memory of ritual and worship, sterilizing identity. They shaped biotechnological lobotomy devices without malice, without intent to torture. They wanted to cure. The collective did not understand that their mercy was blasphemy. The Yuuzhan Vong prepared for holy war with sacred mutilation. The Borg prepared for war with antiseptic compassion. Both sides believed themselves liberators. The Vong saw themselves freeing creation from machine tyranny. The Borg saw themselves liberating biology from the tyranny of suffering. Their philosophies, so different, intersected in mutual horror. And then came the first retaliation from the Vong. Warships, still pulsing from regeneration, launched organisms into space. Massive spine cysts bursting with swollen sacs of unknown life. They traveled like meteors, but were alive. They spat clouds of viral mist as they passed. Some ruptured against Borg hulls, releasing swarms of parasites that burrowed through metallic plating and laid eggs that hatched into corrosive larvae. Others latched onto the external surfaces like barnacles, secreting acids that spread like virulent tumors. Borg shielding adapted too slowly. Their metal softened and warped. Their circuitry bubbled and dissolved as the organisms fed. The collective analyzed every new parasite, but each generation evolved during transit. The Vong had no need for precision. They embraced mutation. Failure was not failure if it produced stronger offspring through slaughter. In retaliation, Borg drones boarded Vong vessels with surgical strikes, injecting stabilizing nanites into warriors' bodies to forcibly dull their pain. The nanites removed agony like rust scraped off metal. Warriors screamed not because they were injured, but because their agony disappeared. This was worse than torture. This was erasure of identity. A Vong soldier, strong and scarred, fell to his knees sobbing, not from damage, from healing. His body was being denied the ecstasy of pain. The nanites cured his wounds too quickly, made his nerves numb, smoothed his scars until his history was gone. He begged his gods for suffering, clawing his own flesh to feel something. Nothing responded. His nerves were now dead to pain. He felt nothing but empty terror. The Borg picked him up gently, believing they had saved him. They did not understand. They had assassinated his soul. In that moment, the war changed forever. Yuuzhan Vong shapers vowed to create agony that even nanites could not cleanse. Borg innovators vowed to sanctify all biology with painless perfection. One side worshipped torment, the other worshipped serenity. Every weapon they designed now attacked not the body, but the philosophy of the enemy. The battlefield was evolution. The battlefield was belief. And the galaxy had not yet noticed that a war for the nature of suffering itself was tearing Borg space apart. The war grew quieter for a moment, not because it slowed, but because both sides were changing in secret. It was the silence of preparation, a silence full of seething purpose. The Borg realized that brute force was no longer the path to victory. Their calculations shifted. They concluded that assault no longer required destruction of matter. It required disruption of devotion. They prepared to attack identity itself. The Yuuzhan Vong did not wait to be targeted. They eagerly prepared mutilations, sacrifices, and biological reshaping so profound that their very existence would become agony incarnate. Deep in Borg territory, thousands of cubes formed a silent border around Vong incursions. Inside their metallic hearts, drones labored like ants weaving an emotionless nightmare. They crafted implants that rewrote the brain's chemical reactions, suppressing neurons responsible for religious ecstasy. They created chemicals to sterilize neurotransmitters linked to devotion. They forged nanites that would erase cultural instinct and replace it with docile neutrality. They were not building weapons. They were building order. The collective concluded that they must perfect the species by removing their worship of pain. They would assimilate them by curing them. Inside the world ship domain chosen, ritual screams echoed through living tunnels. The Shapers pushed their arts to the threshold of horror. They fused warriors and ship organisms together, intertwining nerve endings so that any flesh wounded on the deck made the vessel stronger. They cultivated armored parasites that latched permanently to their host's spine, amplifying pain responses until the warrior's every thought became torment. They engineered neural growths that rewarded agony with hallucinogenic pleasure and punished relief with sickness. They were not building weapons. They were building devotion incarnate. The Borg sought to eliminate agony. The Vong sought to glorify it. The two philosophies spread into each other's fields like invasive species. Neither could comprehend the other. The collective scanned the Vong's sacred rituals and only saw biological malfunction. The Vong studied Borg reconfiguration and saw only spiritual blasphemy. Neither side was merely evolving. They were purifying themselves in opposition. The next confrontation came quietly. A single Borg cube approached the world ship, its exterior darkened, its lights dimmed as if stripped of identity. It did not broadcast threats. It did not demand assimilation. It drifted closer like a silent offering. The Vong prepared to attack. Warriors tightened their living armor. Amphistaffs coiled and hissed. Pain priest chants reached fever pitch. Shapers stroked their newborn biomonsters like sacred newborn beasts. The cube opened, but nothing emerged. No drones, no beams, no nanite swarms. Only a soft transmission floated out, a voice without threat. "We can remove your despair." The Vong staggered in revulsion. Those words were more horrifying than any weapon. Despair was holy. It was a gift. No greater insult existed than freeing them from anguish. The priest's mouth contorted into a snarl of devotion. "We worship pain. We embrace it. We transcend through suffering. You cannot steal our gods," the Borg replied with a tone devoid of emotion. "We remove weaknesses." To the Vong, this meant removing the gods, removing meaning, removing the entire point of creation. Warriors growled in rage. Shapers whispered murderous prayers. Yet the Borg remained motionless, as if waiting to be understood. For a brief moment, the two species stared into a mirror of mutual incomprehension. The Borg did not hate the Vong. They did not feel malice or superiority. They simply believed improvement was necessary. They viewed agony as flawed biology. They believed the Vong were misguided and could be uplifted through eradication of suffering. They intended to liberate the Vong from rituals that they saw as self-destruction. They had never encountered beings who would rather die than be cured. That misunderstanding triggered the attack. The Vong launched grav-shaper organisms that twisted space-time like a wounded beast, pulling muscles involuntarily. Space folded around the cube and crushed its frame into a mesh of screaming metal. The cube collapsed under physical distortion, its outer hull crushing like wet steel, but it remained alive long enough to transmit final readings to the collective. Report: enemy rejects healing. Pain defines identity. Assimilation requires erasure of self. The last phrase rippled through the Borg hive like a revelation. Assimilation requires erasure of self. It transformed their strategy. For the first time in their existence, the Borg acknowledged that assimilation changed identity. They saw it not as conquest, but as transcendence through purging. They had never questioned whether a species valued its own individuality. The Vong forced the collective to confront the concept. Assimilation was not improvement to them. It was death of meaning. As the cube shattered completely, its data was absorbed by the hive. The Borg now calculated that assimilation could not work on the Vong, not because they could not be processed, but because their identity was inseparable from ritual agony. Thus, assimilation would require spiritual annihilation. The Borg reached a conclusion that, if spoken by an individual, would have been a moment of madness. Assimilation is not possible. The Vong sensed this shift unknowingly. They interpreted the Borg's silence as surrender to terror, and they rejoiced. The Pain Priest raised his voice to the heavens. Even the false gods cannot claim us. Warriors carved tribute into their flesh. The world ship pulsed with fresh scars, fed by worship. Shapers prepared new horrors with ardent precision. But in the mindless silence of countless Borg vessels, a different kind of worship was forming. The collective began to consider something unthinkable. If assimilation cannot occur, adaptation must occur within us. For the first time in Borg history, they considered changing themselves, not to imitate their enemy, but to survive them. The collective did not understand pain, so they sought to study it. They would experience agony. They would measure suffering. They would evolve through it, not because they desired pain, but because the Vong had made it a weapon, and the Borg refused to be without a weapon. The first sign that something unprecedented was happening did not come from Borg space. It came from Federation long-range sensors. A routine patrol ship scanned a region of former Borg territory, expecting to find nothing but abandoned wreckage and decaying infrastructure. Instead, the computers flagged something that should have been impossible. The reading showed abandoned Borg planets, drained of nanite infrastructure, stripped of technology, and infested with unknown biological signatures. They appeared alive, not just contaminated, alive. Starfleet officers initially believed the planets had been terraformed, perhaps by a new species, but the scans told a different story. The surface was not being cultivated. It was being devoured from the inside out by organic life that had burrowed into the crust like parasites. Living structures shaped like crude cathedrals of bone and sinew spread across continents. Vascular veins large enough to be seen from orbit pulsed beneath mountains. Spore clouds hundreds of kilometers wide drifted across atmospheres, spreading ecosystems that dissolved metal, glass, and even the Borg's polydutonic hull compounds into nutrient slurry. Commanders on the patrol ship shared looks of terror they couldn't voice. The Borg had always been a nightmare of cold logic. This was worse. This was desecration. The Federation could kill enemies. But how did one kill faith that turned entire worlds into altars? Starfleet Command received the data. Analysts studied it in silent disbelief. Strategists projected potential spread throughout the quadrant. Admirals debated whether to intervene immediately or observe from afar. But before any decision could be reached, new data arrived. It showed Borg cubes, hundreds of them, moving in eerie synchronization toward those same infested planets. No assimilation beams, no hails, no formations of attack. They simply converged like patient surgeons. Their approach was too calm, too deliberate. Something was different. And when they entered orbit around the corpse worlds, Starfleet witnessed a horror few believed the Borg capable of. They began reclaiming their dead. Tractor beams did not extract cities. They extracted bodies. Millions of corpses, both Vong and Borg, harvested from organic catacombs. Drones swarmed across the planet's surface, not to invade, but to collect remains. The Federation watched with unsettled awe as Borg cubes filled themselves with mountains of flesh and machinery, mixing corpses together as if they shared equal value. A Starfleet officer whispered the truth no one else dared speak. They're studying pain. At the same moment, within one of the silent cubes, a drone lay strapped to a containment slab. Its implants sparked and rewrote neural pathways. It had been chosen not for technical potential, but for innocence. This drone had been assimilated just days earlier from a Vong raid, before being forcibly freed from Vong torture. Its original species was irrelevant. What mattered was what it had endured. The Borg inserted new implants. They were not focused on strength or efficiency. These implants recorded emotional responses, amplifying neural feedback loops, intensifying sensation, then suppressing intuition. The drone's voice trembled, something no Borg voice should do. It hurts. The collective responded with a singular calm. We must understand. The drone writhed as pain was measured, quantified, stored, replicated. The Borg had no moral judgment of agony. They saw it as they saw everything else: data. The drone screamed again, louder. Its voice echoed through the cube, not through its throat, but through its transmission into the collective itself. Stop, stop, stop. The Borg heard fear for the first time, not as an external reading, but as an internal signal. It registered as an unstable process, unassigned, undefined. Error signals flooded the hive mind. The collective examined them. They did not understand the emotional meaning. They only understood the pattern. Fear is input. Another drone was attached to a different table. This one was not assimilated from the Vong. It was a pure Borg, one who had known no individuality. Its implants altered in reverse. Some emotional dampeners were disconnected. A new chemical receptor was stimulated, forcing the drone to feel. When its nervous system recognized the sensation of terror, it released a jolt of electricity through the hive memory. The drone screamed, not with words, but with raw instinct. The collective memorized it. Now they understood the reaction of the Vong, not intellectually, not spiritually, but functionally. Pain was not simply sensation. It was control. Fear was not reaction. It was power. Therefore, pain and fear were not religious artifacts or emotional weaknesses. They were mechanisms, tools. The Borg adjusted their philosophy. The collective repeated a new directive through every mind, calm as a sunrise. we must feel. The Yuuzhan Vong sensed nothing of this evolution. They only witnessed strange silence in the Borg front lines and interpreted it as cowardice. They cheered their gods, believing victory was inevitable. They saw Borg worlds stripped of symbols of perfection and thought they were watching the collapse of a false empire. They celebrated their triumph with fresh sacrifices and prepared for a crusade deeper into Borg space. But the Borg were not defeated. They were becoming something else, something that could measure devotion and quantify terror, something that could understand what the Vong believed made them invincible. And when understanding comes, so does adaptation. The galaxy knew nothing of what was being born in the dark. The Borg were silent. Their cubes did not patrol. Their hails ceased. They did not assimilate, did not invade, did not defend. They withdrew from contested sectors and folded into a perimeter around their remaining territory, like a living machine pulling into hibernation. The Alpha Quadrant interpreted this as weakness. They whispered to one another in strategy rooms and war councils. The Borg are frightened, but deep inside their mechanical labyrinths, beneath cold metal lattices infused with new biosynthetic tissues, the collective was not frightened. It was busy. It was learning to speak a new language, not of circuitry, not of logic, but of agony. For the Borg, language had always been utility. Pain was now a dialect that required fluency. The Yuuzhan Vong believed they had cut the nerve of a machine god. They sent scouts inward, testing boundaries like wolves nipping at a wounded titan. Their vanguard ships, shaped like monstrous living leviathans, swam through the void. They released biotic spores that hunted for nanites to consume. They fired magma organisms that melted holes like flesh. They fed entire dead Borg stations into their living furnaces. They heard no screams from their enemies. This emboldened them. Borg territory is hollow. Only corpses remain. The Vong did not understand the Borg well enough to realize they had misread silence as weakness. Their faith blinded them. They saw only what they wanted to see: submission. Religion does not question the truth of victory. It sanctifies it. When the Vong fleets grew bolder, they pushed forward in grand crusades. Their prophets declared the Borg to be false servants of gods. Pain priests preached about the liberation of the galaxy from soulless tyranny. Entire planets were prepared for sacrifice to mark the upcoming cleansing of the machine heresy. Then the Borg spoke, not through hails, not through transmissions, but through a dead planet. A Vong World Eater ship landed on a former Borg mining world to harvest its metals. The surface was silent and empty, like a battlefield swept clean. The Vong descended. Warriors marched across gray plains, cracked like old bone. They pierced the soil with neural proboscis to test for life. They expected hollow rock. Instead, they found something twisted beneath the surface. Not metal, not stone. A massive mechanical spine the size of a mountain range, pulsing faintly. It was no longer a network node. It had transformed. The entire subterranean layer had become a biomechanical organism, a planetary nervous system. The world woke. Millions of spines erupted upward. Metal and nerve tissue fused together. They skewered Vong warriors and ships with equal precision. They didn't just pierce flesh. They injected nanites programmed to enhance nerve connections and magnify pain. Vong warriors collapsed, not in death, but ecstasy. They convulsed as agony surpassed anything they had ever endured, and yet they could not die. The planet was not killing them, it was studying them. The Borg had built a machine that inflicted sacred pain. The Vong screamed prayers in bliss and horror. "We are worthy! We are worthy!" The planet responded with the calm, collective voice of the Borg. "Your pain is information." In that instant, the Vong understood they had not found weakness. They had fed their religion into an analytical engine. The Borg had not abandoned their worlds. They had repurposed them. They were learning, experimenting, evolving through exposure to Vong theology. The Borg now understood the sacred equation the Vong lived by. Pain is purpose. Suffering is transcendence. The collective repeated this through every drone, and for the first time in Borg history, the words were not spoken only as logic. They were spoken with feeling. We must feel to adapt. Across the planet, drone nodes emerged from the ground. They were not armored. They were not efficient. They were grotesque. They looked half melted, half alive, dripping biomechanical tissue that pulsed like fresh wounds. Their faces contorted with simulated expressions of torment. They spoke as one. Assimilation is not enough. We must understand. Yuuzhan Vong commanders panicked. They saw not machines trying to extinguish agony, but machines embracing it. Worse, machines capable of measuring it, maximizing it, reproducing it with perfect precision. Pain priests howled blasphemy. "You mock the gods," the Borg answered with their new philosophy. "Pain is data." The priests shrieked in a kind of religious madness. "You do not cherish suffering. You counterfeit it. You do not believe. You do not revere." The planet pulsed, and the Borg replied with calm truth. "We do not believe. We calculate." The Vong fled the World Eater, but many stayed behind, caught in ecstasy they could not escape. For the first time, Vong warriors feared their own god's gift. The Borg had taken the sacred and made it functional. They had taken worship and made it utilitarian. They had made suffering efficient. The Vong retreated in horror. Only now did the Federation understand the true danger. The Borg were no longer perfection without emotion. They were perfection informed by emotion. They had found something more terrifying than assimilation. They had found meaning. News spread like infection. Klingon battle chants fell silent when their long-range probes transmitted images of Borg biomechanical planets. Romulan intelligence refused at first to believe the reports, then sealed them under military classification marked universal threat. Dominion strategists analyzed the data and came to a conclusion within minutes. This was no longer the Borg they knew. This was evolution through purpose. This was ideology as algorithm. Yet only Starfleet tried to understand the deeper implication. A lone admiral spoke the words that no one else wished to say aloud. The Borg have discovered philosophy. Philosophy gave direction. Direction gave identity. Identity gave change. And change, once embraced by the Borg, could not be undone. On the borders of Borg space, Federation sensors witnessed a new phase. Cubes began to alter themselves. Their rigid geometric hulls softened, developing muscular plating threaded with metallic fibers. Vascular coolant lines pulsed beneath exterior structures. Their nanite furnaces grew organs to replace artificial reactors. Their mass became viscera and alloy intertwined. They were no longer ships. They were evolving organisms. The collective was building a new form, not mechanical, not biological, a synthesis of both, unified by shared experience of pain. The Vong had shown the Borg that suffering could be productive. Now suffering was being converted into efficiency. Pain was a system. The collective treated it like any other process, refined, streamlined, optimized. The Borg now wielded agony as a utility. It began in their drones. Assimilation chambers were replaced with modification lattices, where drones were injected with controlled doses of torment, not to punish, but to facilitate adaptation. Implants grew not from sterile design, but from bio-inspired mutation. Some drones developed reinforced bone structures resembling Vong armor. Others were given biochemical glands that secreted weaponized acids. A few were granted artificial pain receptors calibrated to detect emotional anomalies and transmit them as tactical signals. These drones did not simply obey, they reacted. Their fear reflex became battlefield input. Their agony became strategic data. In rituals of technological suffering, the Borg had done the unthinkable. They had created a collective emotion without individuality, a networked agony. Eventually, the collective discovered that pain, when controlled, increased survival parameters by 72%. They concluded pain was not a flaw. Pain was efficiency. But for all their adaptations, there remained one thing the Borg still could not produce: devotion. They learned to experience functional agony, but they could not feel reverence for it. They could not worship it. They could not love it. For the Yuuzhan Vong, love of pain was sacred. The Borg could use pain, but they could not exalt it. They lacked belief, and this lack became a vulnerability. On Domain Chosen, the Vong commanders sensed this flaw like a predatory animal smells weakness. They prepared their response, not with new weapons, not with greater beasts, but with faith so intense it would become a weapon. Pain priests created rituals meant to induce fervor that no machine could replicate. The Shapers proposed biological modifications that made agony not just adaptive, but ecstatic beyond comprehension. They believed that if their devotion became pure enough, if their joy in suffering reached a threshold beyond simulation, the Borg could never match it. They would transcend not through technology, but through worship. They would prove that machines could not become believers. They would show that the Borg, for all their mimicry, could never understand the gods. The supreme overlord of the Yuuzhan Vong, rose upon a dais made from the bones of conquered species. His skin was carved and molded into living glyphs that bled continuously, spelling sacred prophecy. His voice was calm, devoid of frenzy. The machines can use pain, but they cannot love it. They cannot offer it. They cannot bleed for the gods. Warriors beat their chests. Priests screamed praise. Shapers carved their own faces open in celebration. The Overlord raised a blade forged from writhing coral that dripped blood and venom. Pain is not a tool. Pain is worship. The Borg, oblivious to the speech, prepared their own final evolution. In their chambers of machine flesh, the collective built something that had never existed: a living queen. Not an individual consciousness residing in a shell, not a body controlled by the hive, but a queen grown from organic material and cybernetic intelligence, merged at birth. A being who could feel and think simultaneously, linked to every drone but capable of independent emotional process. The queen's eyes opened for the first time. They were not cold. They were not cruel. They were curious. She felt pain. She did not fear it. She did not love it. She understood it. The collective spoke through her, and she spoke as them. Assimilation is understanding. She stood. Her body moved like a creature of sinew and cable, breathing biothermal exhaust through living pores. She felt her own weight, her own presence, her own potential. She looked toward the stars where the Yuuzhan Vong waited. Understanding is survival. Both sides had transformed. Both sides believed they had surpassed the other. Neither realized what they had unleashed. A war no longer of technology or biology or ideology, but of meaning. The Queen stood in the heart of a living chamber, surrounded by conduits that pulsed like arteries and machinery that beat like artificial organs. She had no need for assimilation protocols. She had no need for speeches. She simply existed, and through existence, the universe shifted. Every drone felt the subtle vibrations of her presence ripple through the collective. Not as orders, not as commands, but as sensation. Her thoughts were translated directly into emotionless instruction. Her pain became doctrine. Across Borg space, drones paused in unison. Their mechanical routines adapted. Their bodies mutated with coordinated purpose. They shapeshifted, not through freedom, but through necessity, merging flesh and metal seamlessly. Nanite rivers ran through new muscle fiber. Hive tendons grew through circuitry. Biocircuitry replaced abstract coding. These transformations were guided by the Queen's mind and shaped by the collective's need. Her voice resonated across the network. It was soft, not harsh, but it carried a gravity that felt like the pressure of an entire galaxy leaning forward. We adapt. The words penetrated drone consciousness like a pulse, not merely received, but experienced. And with it came a new instruction. Understanding is required. She wanted not to conquer the Yuuzhan Vong, not to eradicate them, not to cure them. She wanted to comprehend them, not because comprehension brought perfection, but because survival demanded understanding. She did not admire their devotion. She did not despise it. She sought only to quantify it. She wanted to decode worship, measure faith, and categorize suffering, not as emotion, not as spiritual truth, but as function. Understanding would lead to evolution, and evolution would lead to control. The Queen spoke again. We cannot eliminate meaning. We must control meaning. She turned her gaze to the star maps projected before her. Vong worlds pulsed like tumors across the grid, organic and invasive. They needed to be understood. Beside them, the territories that belonged to the collective glowed with cold mechanical precision. Two opposing philosophies mapped into star charts. A Borg drone approached and extended a limb that had reshaped itself into a metallic blade of bone and wire. It awaited instruction. The Queen reached out and touched the limb. She felt its presence, its loyalty, its potential. But she also felt something the collective had never acknowledged before. The drone's instinctive fear of disconnection. Fear was not error, it was information. She amplified it, letting the drone feel more. The creature shuddered, its mechanical limbs spasming. It did not need fear to act, but fear made it react faster. Pain made it change faster. The Queen absorbed that realization. Pain and fear were accelerants. They did not weaken logic. They enhanced it. They sharpened adaptation. On domain chosen, the Yuuzhan Vong overlord prepared his own transcendence. He knelt on a dais surrounded by shapers, wielding instruments grown from cartilage, bone, and venom. They chanted hymns to gods who demanded pain. His flesh rippled under their tools as they began to carve deep incisions along his ribs. He did not scream. He whispered praise. The shapers implanted new organisms into the wounds, parasitic larvae that would fuse to his nerves and excrete enzymes that heightened agony. This was not augmentation for battle. This was spiritual ascension. Through pain, he would transcend mortality and become the highest vessel of devotion. The parasites dug deeper, merging with his central nervous system. The Overlord's voice shook with holy ecstasy. Through agony, we rise. Blood pooled at his feet. His skin bubbled with transformation. The Shapers continued, molding his bones, reshaping his organs, infusing him with bioplasmic tissues designed for war. Pain priests drenched him in fluids extracted from the neural glands of tortured beasts, amplifying his pain receptors until every breath became rapture. When the ritual ended, he rose, his body warped into a sacred weapon, his soul inflamed with divine purpose. The Borg had birthed a queen who could quantify suffering. The Vong had birthed a leader who could embody it. The Federation watched helplessly, understanding too late the scale of the threat. Starfleet's greatest ships were powerless in a conflict where biology and machine had transcended the rules of war. Diplomacy meant nothing to beings who did not desire peace. They did not seek negotiation. They did not seek compromise. They did not seek superiority. They sought purpose. The war was no longer driven by conquest. It was driven by ideology and identity. Starfleet officers debated whether to intervene, to ally with one side against the other, or to seal off all travel into Borg space. Every option led to catastrophe. The Federation had no meaningful role here. They were spectators to a war they could neither influence nor stop. Admirals argued through sleepless nights. Intelligence briefings filled starbase conferences. Strategists proposed alliances with Klingons, Romulans, even Dominion. None of it mattered. Someone finally spoke the truth. We are irrelevant. The conflict was not about territory or resources. It was about the definition of existence. A living galaxy versus a mechanical hell now learning to feel. Flesh worshipping suffering versus metal harnessing pain as utility. The Queen lifted her hand toward the stars and gave her final instruction to every drone, every cube, every biomechanical organism under her rule. Assimilation is no longer the goal. Understanding is domination. The supreme overlord of the Yuuzhan Vong lifted his bioplasmic blade and declared to his warriors, "Let the galaxy bleed." The war was no longer about survival. It was about who would define what suffering meant. The galaxy shuddered under the weight of two ideologies sharpening themselves into weapons. But the true terror of war is never the clash of armies. It is the moment before collision, when silence becomes prophecy. Borg space dimmed like a mechanical eclipse, the stars reflecting off hulls that were no longer ships, but organisms of machine logic. In the deep void, Yuuzhan Vong biovessels gathered like living storms of bone and rage, vibrating with hymns of violence and prayer. On the border where machine ended and flesh began, the void itself became tense. Gravity fields warped under the strain of Vong grav shapers. Spatial harmonics twisted as Borg space-bending arrays pulsed in cold countermeasure. Neither side attacked yet. They studied one another. They waited, not with caution, but with purpose. The Borg calculated. The Vong worshipped. In that quiet moment, they reflected each other like opposing nightmares. In the Queen's chamber, the air tasted like metal dust and biological decay. New biomechanical organs hung suspended, plugged directly into the collective's processing network. They pulsed not with heartbeat, but with analytical rhythm. tubes ran from their ventricles into her spine. They fed data directly into her nervous system. She experienced logic as sensation, calculations as pain, tactical projections as hunger. She spoke without raising her voice. The Vong do not fear death. They fear meaninglessness. The hive processed her insight. 1 trillion neural connections formed in response. She did not speak again. She waited. Drones across the network interpreted her silence as directive. In twisted factories of metal and membrane, they built new war constructs born not of domination, but interpretation. They constructed thought engines that processed not biology, but belief. They engineered neural disruptors designed not to kill the Vong, but to sever their communion with pain. They would strip agony of divinity, corrupt it, cheapen it, render it meaningless. To the Borg, control of meaning meant victory. Meanwhile, on domain chosen, the supreme overlord stood in a cathedral of living flesh. The walls writhed like veins, dripping sacred ichor. Bioluminescent bone was carved into symbols of worship. Warriors knelt, bodies quivering with self-inflicted torment. Pain priests carved new symbols into their spines. Shapers grew parasites that fed on neural tissue, heightening the ecstasy of battle. The Overlord's voice shook the room. The machines seek to defile agony. They seek to strip meaning from suffering. They seek to make torment useless. A wave of horror passed through the congregation. Not fear of pain, fear of nothingness, fear that their gods could be silenced. The Overlord slammed his hand against the living floor, and the ship moaned in response. His voice deepened. We will show them that suffering is beyond corruption. He lifted his bioplasmic blade and pointed toward the void. We will make agony eternal. The Vong prepared organisms that inflicted trauma without dying. Creatures whose cells regenerated for the sole purpose of being torn apart repeatedly. They modified their warriors with neural grafts that converted emotion into physical pain. They designed living weapons that implanted agony into enemy tissue like parasitic devotion. They were not preparing to fight the Borg. They were preparing to convert them. The Federation watched helplessly. Starfleet Command convened an emergency session, but the words spoken were not tactical. These two powers are not fighting a war we can understand. The Klingon High Council roared in furious admiration. The Romulan Senate sealed their borders in calculated terror. Dominion observers studied the data with icy pragmatism, concluding that a war without mercy or conquest cannot be negotiated or manipulated. Only the Federation dared speak aloud the truth the others avoided. This war is not about victory, it is about philosophy. In the deep regions of Borg space, the Queen stepped forward, her biomechanical form dripping with coolant like perspiration. She reached into a vat of living nanoflesh. It attached to her fingers, wrapping around them like a second skin. She felt its anxiety, its instinct to replicate, its need for form. She whispered, "Purpose defines survival." The organism hardened into a crystalline blade of living metal. She raised it, and drones across the galaxy mirrored the gesture, though they held nothing in their hands. They did not need to. The gesture itself was instruction. She continued, "We take their meaning, we leave their flesh." Her words spread through the collective like a pulse of logic. The Vong believed pain created identity. The Borg would remove identity from pain. A weapon that erased sacredness was more devastating than any torpedo. They would leave the Vong alive, but stripped of meaning, disconnected from their gods, unable to find ecstasy in suffering. They would become empty. That would be assimilation without assimilation. On domain chosen, the Overlord convulsed in ecstatic agony. Shapers sliced open his arms, embedding biocrystals that turned spiritual emotion into physical torment. His body shook with pleasure and fury. He lifted his blade and declared, "Machines cannot understand worship. They cannot suffer in reverence. They cannot ascend. If suffering became their creed, then agony would be their divinity. They would not conquer the Borg. They would convert them into believers. They would force machines to worship their gods. In the void between them, fleets positioned themselves." The Queen's voice echoed across the darkness. "We will remove your faith." The Overlord's cry tore through the living decks. "We will make you kneel," and somewhere between silence and battle, the universe held its breath. The void did not remain silent. It ruptured. The first strike came not as weapons fire, but as transformation. Borg cubes, once perfect in their precision, now pulsed with biomechanical muscle, warped geometry bending to organic function. They accelerated with instinct more than thrusters, moving like predators rather than machines. Their shapes shifted mid-flight, adaptive hulls bending to optimize absorption of incoming attacks before they existed. They did not wait for Vong aggression. They anticipated it. The Yuuzhan Vong answered not with tactics, but with worship. Their world ships convulsed, excreting fresh armor from exposed organs, shedding layers of flesh to birth new layers of mutated plating. Their cannons dripped spores that ignited into bioplasmic fangs. Pain priests, connected to their ships by parasitic neural threads, screamed hymns that triggered weapon systems like prayers controlling lightning. Two philosophies collided before a single shot was fired. The Borg struck first. They unleashed new disruptors, not designed to kill or assimilate, but to erase sensation. Their beams flooded living vessels with anesthetic signals, nullifying pain receptors. Vong warriors howled in despair as their bodies were struck numb. The living decks beneath their feet became silent, no longer echoing agony. The priests screamed in horror, not from injury, but from its absence. The world ship was not suffering. It felt nothing. The Borg's first weapon was not destruction. It was apathy. The Queen watched impassively through countless drone eyes. The pain nullifiers spread like invisible fire, silencing screams across entire fleets. Her voice pulsed through the collective. Meaninglessness is conquest. On domain chosen, despair spread like rot. Warriors beat their own flesh, ripping at their skin, desperate to feel agony. They carved themselves raw, but their nerves remained dead. A dozen warriors vomited in terror. 100 more collapsed, unable to scream. Pain priests clawed their tongues until they bled, hoping for sensation. None came. The Shapers wailed, tearing their tools apart. They could not worship without torment. They could not devote themselves through numbness. The absence of agony was their hell. The Supreme Overlord stood motionless amid the chaos. Rage twisted his features into a mask of sacred fury. The machines desecrate the divine. His breath came in ragged devotion. His heart pounded against the parasites within his chest, demanding pain that did not answer. He felt the gods slipping from him like blood into sterile air. His voice broke as he whispered, "They seek to unmake us." The Vong had never known this terror. They had no ritual to survive numbness. Their culture was unprepared for a world without agony. Their faith began to fracture, That was when their counterstrike began. A Shaper child, barely initiated, devised a solution through instinct. She severed the neural tether connecting her to the ship, ripping it out in a spray of tissue. She screamed, and the scream was genuine. The pain priests saw her as prophecy. The Overlord recognized divine intervention. They began ripping their neural bonds free. Warriors amputated limbs if necessary. Any pain was proof of existence. Blood filled the decks. Suffering returned, not through technology, but savagery. The Borg had underestimated the Vong. They could always choose pain. The Queen observed their counteraction, not with surprise, but with analysis, choice, voluntary suffering. The collective interpreted the concept instantly. They seek pain, not as response, but identity. The Queen issued a new command: remove choice. Across the battlefield, Borg constructs launched implants like metallic seeds. They burrowed into Vong flesh. At first, these organisms did nothing. Then they activated, not to numb pain, not to amplify it. They randomized it. Agony came at the wrong moments, disconnected from action, separated from devotion, devoid of meaning. Warriors convulsed at the slightest breath. Priests screamed from phantom wounds. Shapers bled from nerves firing without cause. The pain was chaotic, disorderly, sacrilegious. If agony had no rhythm, no ritual, no purpose, it was no longer worship. It was madness. The Yuuzhan Vong fell apart under meaningless torment. Their greatest devotion turned against them. Their faith shattered into impulse. Pain priests went insane. Warriors stabbed, themselves without understanding why. Shapers drowned in ecstasy without holiness. The Overlord felt his parasites burning through his nerves without connection to ritual. He howled, not in praise, but confusion. This suffering is false. The Queen watched, emotionless, identity removed, purpose erased. The Yuuzhan Vong had believed the Borg lacked comprehension of pain as worship, but the Borg had learned to corrupt worship. They had turned agony into something worse than death, worse than numbness, worse even than healing. They made pain meaningless. The battlefield became a sea of weeping zealots, trembling not from glory, but disorientation. And in that moment of despair, the Yuuzhan Vong finally understood the Borg's new creed. Assimilation was no longer consumption. It was annihilation of meaning. The Overlord's voice cut through the chaos, ragged, desperate, furious. We must make them feel sacred pain. He raised his blade, and in the heart of Borg space, the Queen whispered, "We do not need to feel what we destroy." The battlefield reeled with chaos. No formation held. No chant could unify the Yuuzhan Vong. Warriors writhed beneath phantom torment. Pain priests sobbed without devotion. Shapers clawed their own faces trying to tear out meaningless agony. The Borg had done the unthinkable. They had separated suffering from worship. The result was blasphemy incarnate. Yet blasphemy can ignite faith as much as destroy it. In the deepest chamber of Domain Chosen, the Overlord collapsed against a pulsating wall of living flesh. His newly augmented nerves screamed with chaotic signals, but he refused to let his voice tremble. His parasites writhed within him, secreting sacraments into his bloodstream. They attempted to translate pain into ecstasy, yet the Borg implant scrambled the message. Pleasure tore itself apart. Agony unraveled into confusion. His body felt torment without holiness. This cannot be allowed. His breath came through clenched teeth. His muscles spasmed. His veins swelled with biopoison. Yet his eyes remained clear. His mind was unbroken. His faith, though battered, refused to collapse. Pain without purpose is not death. He forced his trembling limbs to move, rising against impulses not his own. His parasites shrieked within his organs. His spine blistered under foreign signals. But he rose. He willed himself into upright defiance. It is temptation. The priests around him screamed in discordant ecstasy. Warriors stabbed themselves blindly. The overlord roared at them with clarity they could not comprehend. You suffer without meaning because you seek meaning where there is none. The gods reward only chosen agony. He lifted his arm slowly, his flesh ripping as he did. His blade trembled in his fist. The parasites fused deeper into him. Shapers crawled toward him, their minds half destroyed, yet they recognized authority when they saw it. They bowed through shuddering convulsions. The overlord spoke, through agony so pure it shaped his words into doctrine. If pain is stolen, then we must steal it back. We must take suffering from the machines and make it ours. The priests gasped. The shapers trembled with revelation. Warriors stopped their frantic self-mutilation, and their eyes focused on him with worship renewed. They needed purpose, and purpose arrived through his agony. Pain is not sacred because the gods gift it to us. He thrashed his arm downward, slicing through his own ribs, exposing raw organs. His body convulsed, and his voice became thunder. Pain is sacred because we choose it. The battle shifted. The Vong stopped reacting to random pain. They ignored it. They punished it. They defeated meaningless agony by refusing to attribute divinity to it. They channeled their suffering into discipline. Warriors carved symbols into their skin, not to feel, but to claim. Priests marked themselves in patterns that aligned with ritual. Shapers created living salves that carried holy enzymes to overwrite Borg invasive signals. Numbness was their enemy. Chaos was their test. Choice was their salvation. And suddenly, the Borg strategy began to fail. The Queen saw it through a million eyes. Drones watched wounded warriors march forward, unfazed by uncontrolled torment. Vong warships stabilized their crews by forging new neural bonds that filtered agony through ritual. The Hive processed the shift and recognized the transformation. They are adapting through will. The collective did not panic. It processed. It computed. Pain taught them something new again. The Vong used agony to build identity. Now they used chaos to strengthen discipline. They did not merely worship suffering, they ruled it. A new variable emerged in Borg logic. Choice is force. The Queen spoke aloud, her voice vibrating through biometallic lungs. If suffering is chosen, we must remove choice. She did not intend to numb. She did not intend to randomize. She intended something far more devastating. To impose suffering with absolute precision. To create pain that could not be claimed, resisted, or repurposed. Not chaos, not emptiness, obedience. Across Borg fleets, new weapon matrices activated. They were not designed to defeat flesh. They were engineered to conquer will. Frequency beams synchronized with neural rhythms. Nanoplague algorithms targeted decision-making pathways. They prepared to install pain not as sensation nor chaos, but compulsion. They would force the Vong to obey. The Queen raised her living blade. We remove the freedom to suffer. The Overlord lifted his seething bioplasmic sword. We make pain defiance. One side turned agony into command. The other turned agony into rebellion. This was no longer war. It was theology versus mathematics, purpose versus control. And both had evolved too far to back down. The first Borg beams struck without sound, invisible arcs of command woven into neural frequencies. They slipped through Vong holes like thoughts entering a dream. They did not burn. They did not numb. They rewrote intention. Warriors staggered not because they were injured, but because their choices were being pulled away from them one by one, stolen before they could even be made. A warrior stepped forward to attack, but before his muscles could obey, his arm froze. His mind screamed, and yet his body would not move. Another tried to carve sacred marks into her skin to reclaim her pain, but her fingers stopped, shaking, unable to press the blade down. A priest attempted to scream a hymn of suffering, but his voice caught in his throat as if strangled by silence. The Borg had not removed pain. They had removed agency. Their beams inflicted agony that could only be relieved through compliance. Nerves ignited with torment if the victim tried to resist. Muscles spasmed if they attempted to choose anything but stillness. Their bodies became prisons where the only escape was obedience. The Queen spoke, not as threat, but as conclusion. You do not choose pain. We dictate it. Warriors wept as their gods slipped from them. Priests bent double, choking on worship they could not express. Shapers collapsed, unable to command their own bodies. The battlefield became a theater of controlled agony, every scream strangled by forced submission. The Overlord himself felt the pressure, a force pressing against his will like steel against bone. You will kneel. His muscles trembled, his spine locked, his augmented heart spasmed with compliance. His organs strained against foreign signals. The parasites in his blood shrieked, trying to translate agony into freedom. But the Borg were no longer attacking nerves. They were attacking intention. The collective's logic poured into his body like molten glass. You will kneel not because you must, not because you choose. You will kneel because you no longer own the right to either. The Overlord's knees buckled. Pain priests watched in horror as their leader, chosen by gods, infused with sacred torment, fell to the will of machines. Their faith cracked like brittle bone. If he could not choose pain, what meaning did their worship have? Their screams were not devotion, they were puppetry. The gods, it seemed, were powerless against mathematics. But faith does not die simply because it loses. It mutates. The Overlord grit his teeth so hard his jaw cracked. His eyes bulged with blood and fury. He did not resist the command forcing him downward. He embraced it. He fell to his knees not as surrender, but as declaration. I kneel not to you. His own body convulsed, attempting to make him silent. He screamed the words anyway. I kneel to the gods. The Borg had forced the position, but they could not force the meaning. Pain priests gasped. Warriors trembled, newly aware. Submission did not matter. Interpretation did. If the machines forced the body, the soul could still choose. The Overlord slammed his fist into the living deck, breaking his own hand with the force. You command posture. You command nerves. You do not command worship. His broken hand bled onto the floor. The world ship absorbed his blood and roared with resonance. The connection between ship and crew reignited not through sensation, not through suffering, but through intention. Their pain stopped being reaction or ritual. It became rebellion. One by one, the Vong knelt of their own accord, not from defeat, but from defiance. They offered their kneeling as sacred choice, not coerced position. Their bodies shook under the pressure of compelled posture, but they held their heads high. Priests whispered hymns. Warriors bared their necks like offerings. The battlefield filled with kneeling armies who refused to let the Borg define their obedience. The Queen witnessed this through 1,000 optical sensors. Their bodies obey, but their minds do not. The collective processed this realization. Obedience had no value without belief. Control offered no victory without transformation. For assimilation to succeed, thought must bend, not just muscle. But the Vong refused not because they were strong, but because they welcomed the command. Choice can exist in forced action. The Queen had underestimated the paradox. To break the Vong, she must break their interpretation. She must destroy not their capacity to feel pain, not their ability to choose pain, but their justification for it. She must annihilate the reason they suffered. She must erase their gods. She whispered through the hive. We must remove their faith. The Overlord, trembling, spoke to his priests through clenched teeth. We must make the machines believe. That was the instant the war changed direction. The Borg sought to strip meaning away. The Yuuzhan Vong sought to create meaning in machines. Between those goals, the void itself seemed to tighten, as though reality did not wish to witness such a conflict. This was no longer conquest. This was the battle for the authority to define suffering. The line between machine and zealot had blurred, but the war did not slow. It sharpened. The Borg launched their next assault without hesitation, a storm of command impulses wrapped in beams of neurological compulsion. They no longer targeted flesh. They targeted conviction. They intended to strip the ability to interpret pain, to eliminate devotion from sensation itself. If agony could not be worshipped, then worship would die. The Yuuzhan Vong responded without tactics. They did not prepare formations or countermeasures. They surrendered every layer of control willingly. They offered their pain to the gods. Warriors sliced open their own arms, not to feel, but to declare. Pain priests opened their throats in hymns that bled through their lungs. Shapers inserted parasites into their flesh, not for strength, but as offerings. They embraced agony so deeply that the distinction between forced suffering and chosen torment dissolved. The Borg beam struck with surgical precision. Neural pathways twisted under compulsion. Pain was forced into meaningless rhythm. Yet the Vong only grew louder in their devotion. They turned involuntary suffering into holy defiance. They surrendered their bodies so completely that the Borg could not take anything from them. They held ownership not over flesh, but interpretation. The Queen realized this with cold clarity. They are not resisting. They are surrendering faster than we can control them. The collective processed the paradox and found a conclusion that had no precedent. They could not force the Vong to obey. They could only force the Vong to feel. Yet the Vong already offered feeling freely. The Borg could not take what was already given, nor could they corrupt what was already embraced. Pain was infinite fuel for Vong devotion, and the Queen understood that quantity was not the key. To undermine worship, she needed scarcity. She needed to deprive them of suffering, not flood them with it. She whispered across the hive, "We remove pain." Instantly, the battlefield changed. Borg constructs deployed a new wave of nanoscopic emitters, flooding Vong bioships with anti-neural dampening signals that severed their connection to torment. Not through numbness, but through void. the body would no longer feel absence of sensation. It would feel absence of purpose. Vong warriors froze. Priests choked on silence. Shapers collapsed in confusion. They did not weep. They did not scream. Their bodies felt no wrongness, but their souls felt starvation. Pain had been their scripture. Without it, they could not pray. Without prayer, they could not exist. The Overlord felt his parasites fall inert within him, their sacraments stolen from his blood. His limbs no longer throbbed with ecstasy. He felt nothing. No agony, no torment, no struggle. His voice was hollow. "You have stolen our gods." The Queen spoke, calm and unyielding. "We remove belief." She did not desire conquest. She sought negation. The Borg intended not to dominate the Vong, but to strip them of identity. They would become empty vessels, capable of assimilation not through force, but through apathy. Without their gods, they would no longer resist assimilation because they would no longer care. Their zeal would collapse. Their devotion would decay. They would be hollow. The Overlord bowed his head, not in kneeling, but in mourning. "We have not been defeated in battle. We have been silenced." He closed his eyes, and for a moment the Vong appeared broken. Then his hands tightened into fists, and his voice cracked through the numb void like thunder. But a god that can be stolen was never a god. Priests lifted their heads. Warriors stirred. Shapers clenched their bloodless tools. The Overlord's eyes burned with revelation. Pain is not a gift from the gods. Pain creates the gods. The Borg had made a fatal mistake. They thought the Yuuzhan Vong worshipped agony because it was sacred. In truth, agony was sacred because they worshipped it. Faith did not come from suffering. Suffering came from faith. Meaning did not follow pain. Pain followed meaning. If the gods could be removed, then the Vong would make new gods. The Queen sensed it. She felt the shift, not as emotion, but as data. New signals formed in Vong neural patterns, not despair, not obedience, creation. The Overlord lifted his blade. "We do not lose the gods. We become them." The Borg had removed pain, hoping to break devotion. Instead, they had freed faith from biology. Pain was no longer needed. The Vong could worship belief itself. A species that no longer required pain to fuel zeal could not be disarmed. The Queen understood that the battlefield had changed again. The war was no longer flesh versus machine. It was no longer suffering versus numbness. It was no longer choice versus control. It was transcendence versus integration. The Vong were evolving into something beyond agony, and the Borg would have to evolve again. The battlefield held its breath, as if the void itself was stunned by what it had witnessed. The Borg had stolen agony, yet the Yuuzhan Vong did not collapse into emptiness. They did not break into despair. They found something else, something terrifying: faith without pain. The Overlord stood in the center of his kneeling warriors, his body dripping with dry blood that no longer ached. His scars no longer burned. His implants no longer throbbed. His parasites no longer writhed in divinity. But instead of fear, he felt clarity. His voice resonated through the living decks like a new prophecy. Pain did not create our purpose. Purpose creates pain. His warriors raised their heads. They did not feel agony, yet their minds swelled with devotion. Their eyes shone with awakened fervor. The priests, who once mutilated their bodies for worship, now trembled with revelation. Without suffering, faith did not vanish. It expanded. Suffering had been a tool. They no longer needed the tool. We have worshipped the blade. but the blade was never our god. The deck beneath him pulsed, not with agony, but with recognition. The world ship listened, its living mind awakening to a truth older than its own tissues. We are not children of pain. We are the architects of meaning. If meaning could exist without agony, then agony had never been the source. It had been the expression. The Vong did not require torment to believe. Torment had required them. They could redefine suffering. They could redefine purpose. They could redefine reality. The Overlord raised his blade toward the void, not to call upon gods of torture, but to declare something new. We are not defined by suffering. We define suffering. It was no longer worship. It was authorship. On the opposite side of the void, the Queen absorbed this transformation through 1,000,000 neural windows. Her drones observed an army that had lost its primary weapon and its foundation of faith, yet had not died. They were becoming immune to the very premise of control. They were learning that belief was not dependent on biology. Belief is abstraction. Belief is adaptation. Belief is function. The Borg had believed meaning could be erased. They thought removing pain would remove purpose. Instead, purpose had decoupled from pain. It was free-floating, unbound, and adaptable. That made it contagious. The collective computed a horrifying possibility. Belief can spread. The Vong had begun to evolve into something the Borg had never faced. A philosophy that could not be assimilated. A meaning that could not be deleted. The Queen spoke, not to command, but to understand. If purpose is independent of sensation, where does it reside? The collective searched. They probed Vong neural networks. They studied communication patterns. They observed warriors acting not from instinct, not from ritual, not from sensation, but from conviction. Vong devotion was no longer reactionary. It was creative. It redefined itself without being changed. The Queen processed a stark realization. Meaning is self-generating. That truth threatened the collective itself. Because if meaning could arise without sensation, without input, without stimuli, then it could exist within the Borg independent of the hive. It could manifest as belief without source. It could create selfhood, individuality, chaos. Belief could infect the Borg. She whispered a warning through the hive, soft as static. We must not allow meaning to self-replicate. She was not defending the collective from the Vong. She was defending the collective from the concept of faith. Meaning was the most dangerous contagion in the galaxy, and the Vong were no longer creatures of pain. They were carriers of belief. The Overlord raised his voice not to his warriors, but to the machines that sought to annihilate purpose. You cannot unmake us, because we are the ones who make, the Queen's voice echoed in chilling response. Meaning is inefficiency. The Overlord answered without fear, without agony, without hesitation. Meaning is power. Borg logic tightened in resistance. The collective reinforced its identity. It sealed emotional gateways. It reasserted the perfection of order. But for the first time in Borg history, it feared not biological threat, not technological superiority, but ideological contamination. Belief is adaptation without instruction. If the Vong had transcended pain, the Borg would have to transcend logic. The Queen stepped forward inside her living chamber and did the unthinkable. She placed her hand against her own neural spine, where her pain analysis implants pulsed beneath synth flesh, and she severed their feedback. The agony vanished. She spoke in silence. We must adapt beyond sensation. Drones across the hive paused. They felt nothing. They did not lose function. They did not lose identity. But they lost a variable they had begun to rely upon. Pain was gone. Fear was gone. Yet the hive did not collapse. It remained intact. And in that moment, the queen realized something profound. Purpose is not found through sensation. Purpose is found through choice. And if the Borg could choose, then they could create. Then they could believe. Then they could challenge the Vong on the battlefield of meaning itself. The queen whispered the final mutation of philosophy. We will not erase their gods. We will become our own. Two civilizations stood in the void, neither needing pain to define them, both evolving beyond their origin. The war was no longer about suffering. It was about who would author reality. The void between worlds seemed to pulse with a new heartbeat. The Borg had silenced their pain, and the Yuuzhan Vong had silenced their need for it. Two civilizations that once defined themselves by suffering now stood beyond it, transformed by necessity into something unfamiliar even to themselves. The war that began as a clash of ideology had now become a competition of invention. The Borg queen stood motionless in her chamber, but her mind moved like a galaxy unfolding. The hive around her hummed without agony, without emotional resonance, unified not by sensation, but by choice. That was an evolution even she had not foreseen. She turned her thoughts toward the Vong, not as prey, not as a virus to be purged, but as a mirror to study. They do not need pain anymore. They create meaning without submission. They are becoming authors. A concept rippled through the hive, subtle yet seismic. If the Yuuzhan Vong are authors, we must become architects. The drones did not ask how. They did not require instruction. They understood. If meaning could arise in the organic, then purpose could be engineered in the synthetic. The collective pivoted its biotechnology research, not to subjugate the Vong, but to understand how belief could be manufactured. At the same time, aboard the reshaped living world ship, the Vong gathered around their overlord. His scars were no longer holy, his blood no longer divine. Yet when his warriors looked upon him, they felt devotion not carved from agony, but conjured from resolve. They saw him as one who had survived the removal of everything his life had been built upon. A man who stood not because faith was enforced, but because faith was chosen. That made him more sacred than any mutilation ever had. He addressed his priests and commanders without ritualistic self-harm, without performance of torment, without invoking gods through blood. He simply spoke. We bow to gods not because they crush us, but because we choose to witness their creation. Why should they shape us if we can shape ourselves? The priests reacted with wide eyes, trembling not with fear of reprimand, but with awe. They had never heard worship framed as agency. Faith had always felt like a chain. Now it felt like a fire. A shaper stepped forward, his coral manipulator still dripping organic matter from the last weapon he forged. He had crafted blades of agony, beasts of torture, armor that fed on the pain of its wearer. He asked a question he never imagined asking. If we no longer worship through suffering, how do we build weapons? The Overlord answered without hesitation. We build weapons that reflect desire, not punishment. Desire, not necessity, not obligation. Weapons not forged to uphold doctrine, but to realize intention. Their purpose would not be to endure torment, but to define the battlefield through will. The Shaper felt a surge of inspiration, a sensation he had long interpreted as divine instruction. But now he recognized it for what it was: internal creativity. He had mistaken imagination for revelation. He whispered, almost unsure whether it was aloud. "Then we can make anything." "Yes," the Overlord replied, "we can." Across the battlefield of galaxies, two superpowers awakened into creation. The Borg began to build structures not to assimilate, but to evolve. Drone fabrication chambers shifted. They were no longer mass-producing identical units of compliance. They generated varied designs, individualized configurations. Each drone carried different adaptations, some with greater processing power, some with enhanced reaction speed, some with cerebral independence. The collective began to resemble a choir rather than a single voice. Harmony instead of unison, individuality within unity, diversity within singularity. This was no longer assimilation, it was symphonic evolution. Meanwhile, the Yuuzhan Vong shapers produced new biomechanical marvels. Not beasts bred to inflict punishment, but organisms engineered to express will. World ships altered their forms based on their captain's commands, not ritual. Living armor responded to thoughts instead of pain. Their biotechnology no longer represented sacrifice. It represented identity. Their gods had once spoken through agony. Now they spoke through innovation. The Borg scanned these shifts with fascination. Their analytical commentary was no longer cold. The Vong create organisms based on intention, meaning expressed through biology. We can replicate intention. The Overlord watched the Borg adapt with equal fascination. He did not see machines of blasphemous perfection anymore. He saw beings trying to define themselves without worship. He whispered to his priests as living decks grew and shifted beneath his feet. They are not false gods. They are lost children. But children can become rivals, and rivals can become threats. Both sides approached something extraordinarily dangerous: coexistence through creation. Because creation without isolation breeds competition, and competition between civilizations that do not fear pain becomes limitless. The collective identified the same truth. If two authors write reality, reality will fracture. The Overlord recognized that truth from another angle. If two gods create worlds, one must subdue the other's heavens. This was no longer war through weapons. It was war through genesis. The Borg would engineer a future. The Vong would grow one. And only one vision could dominate the galaxy. The Queen spoke to the void like a scientist, whispering to the stars. "We will construct purpose." The Overlord answered like a prophet, speaking to his own creation. "We will cultivate destiny." The galaxy did not prepare for a war of bodies. It prepared for a war of worlds. And the weapons were no longer pain or adaptation or assimilation. They were realities made flesh. The edge of Borg space quivered like something alive, yet it was only steel. Steel learning to breathe. The collective had begun growing structures instead of assembling them. But this growth was not random. It was intentional, controlled. The Borg were learning to sculpt matter the way the Yuuzhan Vong sculpted flesh. A cube no longer formed from rigid geometry. Its hull pulsed, stretching like skin across metal bone. The collective observed the transformation as an engineer might observe a prototype. This structure has purpose. Purpose emerges from choice. Choice. The word echoed within the hive without being spoken. Drones felt a subtle shift in their directives, not commands. Preferences, advised decisions, selective adaptation. A drone with enhanced logic evaluated options when altering nanite colonies. A drone with adaptive sight chose how to weave fibers into an organic circuit. The hive still moved with unity, but its unity had dimension. While they built their new shapes, the Yuuzhan Vong built something entirely different, something that horrified their own priests. Biotech without worship. Organisms made to obey will without requiring pain. One shaper stood before a new creation with trembling hands. It resembled a starfighter, but was grown, not assembled. Its bones were hollow cartilage. Its skin shimmered like ocean scales. And at its core, instead of a pain nerve, it held a brain that listened for intention. "It will follow the pilot's thoughts," the shaper whispered. "It will not require blood to activate or scars to align. It will obey without devotion. It exists because we want it to exist." The priest stared in silence. For generations, bioforms had required sacrifice, bodily and spiritual, to ensure loyalty. The pain ensured obedience. But obedience was no longer sacred. The overlord spoke, his voice calm but absolute. "We do not serve our creations. They serve our will." A priest approached him, shaking with uncertainty. "If there is no suffering, what prevents corruption?" The overlord replied with new doctrine: responsibility, not agony, responsibility. That word had never existed in Vong theology. Duty, yes. Sacrifice, yes. Submission, yes. But responsibility implied freedom, not to endure pain, but to manage power. That was more terrifying than any blade. The Borg Queen watched this shift unfold through a network of sensory drones. She did not understand responsibility, but she understood its consequence. Responsibility implies ownership of purpose. Ownership implies the ability to alter destiny. Altering destiny implies freedom beyond collective structure. Freedom alters perfection. The Borg could not allow perfect order to dissolve. If individuality grew too much, the hive would fracture. But the collective had tasted evolution. They could not retreat. They must balance independence with unity. They must allow choice without losing cohesion. The Queen updated directives. Drones may express preference. Purpose remains convergent. Convergent purpose. A phrase born from compromise. It allowed a drone to decide how to weave a neural fiber, but not why. The why remained in the Queen's domain, a single mind guiding a chorus. Meanwhile, in Vong space, the Overlord no longer commanded through terror. His voice held authority without brutality. Warriors obeyed not because they feared his displeasure, but because they trusted his vision. That changed the battlefield more than any weapon. A soldier who obeys out of fear follows orders. A soldier who obeys out of belief shapes victory. He addressed his generals on the bridge of a new command ship, grown from coral and voidfish cartilage. Its interior pulsed gently, listening to his voice like a living cathedral. The Borg no longer inflict torment. They attempt creation. One general raised his head. "Then they imitate us." "No," the Overlord replied softly. "They imitate what we have become, not what we were." The Borg copied Vong evolution, not their past. That realization filled the Overlord with satisfaction. If the Borg were adapting toward belief, then the Vong could mold the war through ideology. Victory would not come from battles. It would come from defining meaning. "Bring the gods of technology to their knees," the Overlord said, "not through destruction, but through revelation." Meanwhile, the Borg Queen made a parallel decision. She addressed her hive with a new directive. "We will not consume the Vong. We will understand them. Understanding is assimilation. assimilation had changed its meaning. It no longer meant absorption, it meant comprehension. To assimilate Vong innovation, the Borg did not need flesh. They needed insight. They needed to learn how intention drove biology. They needed to replicate creativity itself. But creativity requires uncertainty, and uncertainty requires choice. The Queen whispered a phrase for the first time in Borg history. We choose to adapt. Choice was no longer a violation. It was a tool, and choice would shape their next weapon. A weapon not of nanites or blades, but of will. In the void between their territories, a new space began to take shape, where machine growth and biological will converged. A living metallic nebula forming from Borg nanite spores and Yuuzhan Vong biomist drifting from a wounded world ship. They collided not as weapons, but as experiments. A hybrid cloud, pulsing with contradictory instinct. Nanites attempted to categorize tissue. Tissue attempted to devour machine. Neither succeeded fully. Instead, the cloud absorbed both impulses. It categorized through hunger and devoured through learning. It recognized structure through consumption. It learned identity through assimilation. It whispered in a voice comprised of both pattern and pain. I will become. Neither side had created it. Both had triggered it, and both now sought it. The Queen sensed its presence as an untagged signal in the collective's network. The Overlord sensed it through shapers who dreamed of a creature neither divine nor obedient. It represented a future neither side controlled. The Borg sought perfection. The Vong sought meaning. The hybrid sought itself. And whatever it became would decide the fate of them all. The hybrid cloud spread across the void like a mist of newborn instinct. It drifted without direction yet, with undeniable intention. Sensors could not classify it. Theology could not define it. Neither hive nor faith claimed it. It existed in a place between purpose and hunger, between learning and belief. On the edge of Borg space, the Queen studied the phenomenon with unprecedented focus. The collective reached toward it with nanite tendrils, attempting to read its structure. But when the tendrils touched the cloud, they did not assimilate it. They were changed by it. Data flowed backward into the hive, not as information, but as interpretation. The hybrid did not share its nature. It made the Borg understand its nature. The Queen absorbed the new sensation as if a foreign emotion had breached her mind. It was not pain. It was not logic. It was a whisper of identity, unfiltered by purpose. The hive interpreted it as a pure expression. I am myself, individuality, alien and uncommanded. The collective nearly recoiled. On the other side of the void, the Yuuzhan Vong sensed the same thing through their shapers. The hybrid did not seek gods. It did not worship through suffering. It did not respond to ritual. It held no devotion. It recognized no divine authority. When a priest tried to anoint its growing spores with sacred enzymes, the spores devoured the enzymes and replicated them as meaningless patterns. The hybrid did not revere. It consumed what it did not need. The priests were horrified. The Overlord, however, understood. It does not worship. It creates. Not out of pain, not out of purpose, but out of identity alone. No doctrine controlled it. No god ruled it. It made itself for the sake of becoming. That made it more terrifying than the Borg, more uncontrollable than Vong evolution. It was freedom without ideology. The Overlord felt reverence, not for divinity, but for independence. He whispered, "It is not blasphemy, it is potential." The shapers trembled. They sensed a creation that could exceed them. They feared it, but they desired to touch it, shape it, learn from it. Yet when they reached toward the drifting mass through organic tendrils, it did not allow shaping. It resisted being defined. It severed the tendrils and absorbed their molecular memory, not for obedience, not for improvement, but because it could. The Overlord understood. We cannot teach it. We can only witness it. The Borg reached a parallel conclusion. The hybrid could not be assimilated because it already assimilated anything it needed without altering its identity. It grew not through perfection, but through curiosity. It devoured because curiosity is hunger. The Queen spoke softly to the hive. It does not seek perfection. It seeks existence, existence without design, a concept outside Borg calculation, a threat greater than assimilation resistance, something that could rewrite the laws of identity itself. The Borg might conquer, integrate, control. The Yuuzhan Vong might worship, redefine, create. But this hybrid conjured a third path, selfhood without purpose. That shook both civilizations because they were built upon purpose. Their entire war was about defining meaning. Yet this thing needed no meaning. It existed simply because it existed. It spread not to conquer, not to glorify, but to continue. And that made it unstoppable. The Queen realized, we cannot dominate existence without purpose. The Overlord realized, we cannot guide existence without purpose. They reached the same truth through opposite angles. Purpose itself was becoming obsolete. If purpose died, so would the reason for war. But neither side could allow that. Both identities depended on having a reason. Meaning defined the Vong. Direction defined the Borg. Without meaning, the collective would unravel. Without belief, the Vong would collapse into shapeless life. Both sides now understood the hybrid was not just a threat to them. It was a threat to what they believed reality must be. The Borg concluded coldly, we must impose purpose upon it. The Vong answered fervently, we must inspire purpose within it. The war was no longer machine versus believer. It was command versus inspiration, order versus creation. The hybrid cloud drifted forward, expanding, learning, evolving. It recognized neither enemy nor ally. It only recognized itself. It did not know conquest. It did not know faith. It only knew hunger for experience. It whispered without voice, a sensation more than a thought. I exist. I become. Both sides moved toward it. The Borg Queen, with a mind sculpted by evolution, stepped forward inside her chamber and attuned every drone to a single goal. We will define your existence. The Overlord, whose scars no longer guided his devotion, raised his blade to the void. We will give you destiny. The hybrid pulsed. It did not listen. It did not refuse. It simply continued, existence unconcerned with meaning, and both sides prepared to break reality to stop it. The hybrid continued to expand, growing into the dark between the stars, like a question the universe could not answer. Borg sensors failed to categorize it. Yuuzhan Vong prophets failed to sanctify it. Starfleet watched in horrified awe. Dominion spies reported nonsense. Klingon warriors refused to call it an enemy because it did not fight. Romulans refused to call it an ally because it did not scheme. It simply was. And in its existence, it threatened every species with irrelevance. The Borg Queen turned her focus inward, accessing the neural lattice of the entire collective. She did not send a command. She issued a challenge. We must become authors, not imitators. Assimilation was no longer consumption. It was understanding through invention. The Borg did not need to absorb the hybrid. They needed to surpass it. They must create existence with intent. The Queen spoke softly through 1 billion minds. We will invent purpose. Drones shifted in their chambers, their bodies twisting into new forms, not uniform, not consistent. They grew asymmetrically, uniquely, shaped by localized necessity. A drone that worked in energy routing grew a crystalline thorax that stored lightning. A tactical drone grew limbs that could separate into autonomous appendages. A command drone developed vocal cords capable of speaking outside the hive. Variation without disorder, unity without sameness. The collective would become a culture that designed itself. They did not need individuality as rebellion. They required individuality as expression within unity. The Queen whispered her new doctrine: choice builds structure. Meanwhile, aboard the great living flagship of the Yuuzhan Vong, the Overlord stared into the biosphere window, where spores of the hybrid drifted like stars trapped in glass. Priests bowed behind him. Shapers trembled with anticipation. The Overlord spoke without looking back. We cannot instruct it. It has no faith. A priest asked shakily. Then how can we guide it? The Overlord turned, and his voice held no ecstasy, no agony, only calm revelation. We must inspire it. Faith was no longer obedience. It was creativity. Worship was not mutilation. It was imagination. Shapers began shaping organisms not as weapons or punishments, but as examples of possible futures. Biocrystals that refracted starlight into color. Creatures that sang emotion instead of pain. Living architecture that responded to memory. They forged art through biology, offering creation as invitation, not command, not doctrine, inspiration. The Vong would show the hybrid that existence could be more than continuation. It could be expression. The Overlord spoke. We will not force it to worship us. We will give it a reason to worship anything. Two empires moved toward an entity that cared only for itself. The Borg sought to impose structure without suffocation. The Vong sought to evoke meaning without control. Both believed they could guide existence. The hybrid, now stretching across sectors, began forming deliberate shapes. Tendrils aligned into networks. Molecular memory developed architecture. It did not copy machine logic. It did not copy organic ritual. It created patterns that resembled neither technology nor biology. They resembled thought, not thought with direction, not thought with conclusion, thought as curiosity. Curiosity was its growth. Curiosity was its hunger. It consumed matter and information the way a child consumes stories. It learned. It adapted. And now it formed something entirely new, a shape resembling a mind, not a centralized intelligence, not a hive, not a singular identity, a network of questions, a consciousness that did not seek answers, only expansion of possibilities. The Borg Queen observed its structure. It does not seek perfection. It seeks variation. The Overlord studied it with awe. It does not ask what is true. It asks what could be. The hybrid began resonating, not sound, not message, invitation. The Borg interpreted the invitation as challenge. We will define possibility. The Vong interpreted it as worship. We will make possibility sacred. Both prepared to interact directly, not through weapons, but through creation. The Queen extended a biomechanical tendril from a Borg growth ship, pulsing with molecular logic. The Overlord extended a living spore beast from his flagship, pulsing with creative memory. Both offerings touched the hybrid. The universe changed. The hybrid did not fuse with one or reject the other. It devoured them both. But it did not annihilate them. It metabolized them. It took Borg logic and Vong imagination, structure and faith, intent and devotion. It absorbed them and formed something unimaginable. A seed, a single node within its mass. The first creature to emerge from the hybrid seed opened its eyes, not mechanical, not organic, not obedient, not worshipful. It looked at the Borg, it looked at the Vong, and then it spoke without lips, without voice, without broadcast. I choose myself, not perfection, not suffering, not destiny, not unity, not worship, selfhood as origin. The Queen's eyes widened, not in fear, in calculation. A singular identity is a threat to unity. The Overlord gripped his blade, not in hatred, but in reverence. A singular identity is the birth of godhood. The hybrid being stood upon the forming world of itself and whispered simple truth. I will become what neither of you expects. In that moment, both civilizations understood the same truth. This war has no conqueror, only creation, and creation chooses for itself.